representative and an expert on politics and government. Charles Riley of John A. Steer Company is our Legislative Committee Chair and a strong contributor to our Government Affairs program. We are excited to have both of these experts with us today, so without further delay, I will get things started and turn it over to you, Charles.
Why should I be a political activist? That's going to be my big topic for today before we get into John's presentation, because John's going to have a really good outline of why you should be a political activist, but I'm going to go a bit into some details too. And one, the biggest reason is that you want to be able to determine outcomes to laws, regulations, and policies that affect your business. You don't want to have where other people are getting into the politicians' offices to be able to state a view that is contrary to what you believe might assist your daily operations or to your customers. For one example, on the Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act, the NCBFAA fought against the more robust regulation on how we would be handling power attorneys and what our responsibilities would be handling power attorneys. So in essence, when the final rule came out, it basically had the responsibility of being able to provide a valid POA to the brokers. That responsibility was for the importer and not the broker. The broker was basically to be able to collect the power attorney, but the information on the power attorney is really the proper and correct information is to be supplied by the importer. And another one that is really important is the waterways bill and the harbor maintenance fees. That 100% of those fees will be to dredging. I mean, there are particular ports, especially a port like New Orleans, which this is really of interest to them, because if the ships cannot get up the river, they're going to lose their business. So just two examples of being able to have where we have really a big influence in Washington on the outcomes of those bills. Upcoming that we foresee, some of the bigger issues that you can really have some influence on is ACE spending is going to be a big issue. Customs has asked for increased spending to be able to keep ACE going, because originally they had the funding to be able to initiate ACE, but they did not have any funding for ongoing corrections to ACE. So that's going to be something big. How to participate in the process? Well, grassroots, you can always start with your local association. Get involved with them because they are very in tune, especially through the APN, the President's Network, to be able to know what's going on at national. So I would suggest start there. It'll kind of get your feet wet a little bit, and then you'll be able to participate in the NCBFAA if you feel like you need to be able to have a little bit of a foundation before joining the NCBFAA legislative issues. Really, you should have no worries whatsoever. It's very easy. From somebody who went down to Washington probably about 8 or 9 years ago, you know, you kind of get nervous, but your nerves get over very quickly once you get in and talk to the staffing members. Support the Political Action Committee. That's another way that you can support your political process. The NCBFAA has a very active PAC. We support legislators and senators who are very friendly to our industry. So that doesn't really take much. It takes a little bit of financial, but the PAC, no amount is too small to be able to send to the PAC. Join the NCBFAA Legislative Committee. We support John in all his work on the Hill, and also to the committees that make up the NCBFAA, the Import Committee, the Transportation Committee, the Regulatory Action Committees. We're there to support them. Some people on this call, you know, especially with the regulatory affairs, you might have a lot of business going through FDA, EPA, USDA, and we need to be able to also stay on top of those government agencies. Besides Congress, we also need to be able to work with the agencies themselves when they issue the regulations. Now, it's a little bit challenging, but we also like to be able to ask our members to be able to stay on top of events that are happening with the WCO and the WTO. More and more of those agencies are also having a profound influence on regulations and processes that CBP has in place. So it'd be really critical for you in the future to start following what's going on in those. And again, you know, you read the MMAB that the NCBFAA issues every Monday. They always have up-to-date information on what's going on and happening with the WCO and WTO. So before I turn it over to John, I would just like to be able to welcome everyone to the phone call. And I would really appreciate if people can reach out to us and to be able to join a legislative committee, because as we stated, it's really important. The more voices we have and the more voices that are heard, the better it is for us to be able to choose our outcome on regulations and laws. Okay, now I'll turn it over to John.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back on the webinar circuit with you. Today, it's one of a number of webinars that we've done, but it's the steps that we've been taking have been to educate the membership following the election of Donald Trump, which we knew would be a watershed moment in terms of trade. I think trade has gone on for a number of years without too much difference, just a matter of emphasis rather than difference. And as we move through the Bushes and the Clintons and Obama, things aren't all that drastically different. But we recognize that things could be different under the Trump presidency. So we've done a number of sort of updates, and this is one of those. Let me just say that, you know, following the campaign, the administration was confronted with the need to govern, and immediately the president put into place a number of hardliners that had very profound views on trade, and a lot of that sort of fed into the campaign, and then after the campaign, sort of bled into the first days of the administration. So Steve Bannon was a major factor, and I think everybody's familiar with him. Navarro, West Coaster, had equally strong views. So let's turn the slide, please. So you'll recognize the president, and you may recognize Justin Trudeau on the left and Enrique Peña Nieto on the right. The changes that took place as time went on came from discussions that existed between these three principles. But in addition, I think there was some pressure from border and ag states, those dependent on Mexican exports, our imports. And there sort of came a sobering up time where there was a recognition that these elements of trade were vital to our U.S. economy. And so there was a metamorphosis from pulling out of NAFTA to what we now euphemistically call modernizing NAFTA. So China was also a major bone of contention in the early going during the campaign. There were cries of identifying Beijing as a currency manipulator. But then there was oil poured on those waters with the meeting between President Xi and President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and I think that the personal relationships became a little bit more clear and better. So why the change? Why have things sort of during that period of time moved to a more softer approach. Well, I think the person you're seeing in this next slide, Gary Cohen, is a major influencer in that. Cohen comes from Goldman Sachs. He's one of those investment bankers that we heard about during the campaign. But he took over the job as the National Economic Council director, and that gave him a foothold within the White House that was very strong, and he followed it up by hiring a very expansive and talented staff, one of whom talked at our last GAC. Everett Eisenstadt became his deputy and was the sort of the person out front on the G2 talks that we've just concluded. But Cohen had a very profound influence on the president, and as we've noted in the bottom bullet there, the president liked his pragmatic but assertive style, and that gave him a big foothold at the White House. At the same time, there were clashes, and next slide, please, between different players at the White House. Bannon got into hot water because of his getting a little too much attention publicly, and Navarro kept finding himself on the wrong side. And whereas initially we thought that the National Trade Council would be sort of the hub, the place to go at the White House, his role as the director of the National Trade Council morphed into a much smaller role. His staff is tiny, just 1 or 2 people. He has input, but it's really waned since the beginning of the administration. I think Bob Lighthizer is a key player right now for us to pay attention to. He was recently confirmed by the Senate, and his presence on Capitol Hill has got a great importance in terms of making them satisfied with the direction the administration is going. He was at one point the staff director at the Senate Finance Committee, so he knows how it works up on the Hill. At the same time, he's had a lot of hard-nosed positions on trade enforcement, and so that has at least won him some distance from being classified as a career bureaucrat or as a stripy pants diplomat. He's had tough positions, and he hasn't been called into account for any of his positions within the administration. I think that what we do see is that what we thought we were going to get at the very beginning of the administration has changed somewhat, but I don't think we can now start seeing a trend line that tells us exactly where we're going. And as the slide notes, this is only the beginning. The final player that I think I've identified for you before, Wilbur Ross, is the Secretary of Commerce, and you'll recall his background being putting together companies involved or dismantling companies that were involved in the steel industry. So he's had the big battles, and he's seen the downside of foreign competition. I think you've all heard of a number of the executive orders that came out under Wilbur Ross's name that he initiated. The trade deficits position was one that NCBFAA commented on at some length, pointing to how e-commerce was making its mark in terms of the numbers that you have to add when you come to whether we have a trade deficit or not. And then there were violations of customs law, and of course the focus there was on IPR and on other elements of trade where there was sort of unfair competition. He also called for a review of the existing trade agreements, of which there are many. And most recently, we've had a national security review of steel and aluminum imports. The ITC, International Commerce Commission, recently issued its report to Congress, and Congress is interested in following up on the aluminum oversupply issue. We're still waiting for something to come out of the review on steel. And let me also add here, insofar as regulations are concerned, let's not forget the old 2-for-1, where we were going to take out 2 for every new regulation we offered. And that's proven to be problematic insofar as it's kept frozen a number of things that I think people want that would be improvements. But nonetheless, that remains in place. And then there was an embargo on new regulations. So what other things have been done in the area of trade that kind of rocks the boat a little bit internationally? Canadian software lumber, the tariffs, Exim Bank. We've seen that the Exim Bank has been held hostage during the last years of the Obama administration, and then there was some optimism about its going forward, and new appointees have somehow sort of muddied the waters a little bit. And then, of course, the steel, as I've mentioned before. The steel issue is based on a Section 232 of a 1962 law that links trade with national security. It provides an out to the WTO agreements and permits countries to unilaterally determine as to what is in their national security. It's a loophole, call it, if you're unhappy with the results, and it's a means of going forward that the administration has identified. But in summary, during the past few months, there's been no guidance overall insofar as the strategy. It's just an issue by issue debate. And often that has called into play a pitch battle within the White House. Often it's involved Ross and Bannon running up against Cohn. And if the steel tariffs or the resolution of the steel issue is strong and very anti-China, I think you can see who might have won that battle. Flip side is Gary Cohn has been waging a strong fight to be moderate in terms of our execution of this Section 232. Another point I'd make too is that this is all about imports, which is translatable to jobs. It's not about exports, which is equally translatable to jobs. But interestingly, it's the exports where the concessions have to be made. If we're going to get into a bilateral trade negotiation with another country, they're going to expect concessions on exports, our exports. It's uncertain whether we're willing to do that and what they might be. We also see some shifting gears on China, and I think the one thing you can see is that there's a mix of military, diplomatic, economic, and even domestic political policy all sort of interwoven here. And we want China's involvement in terms of North Korea, but on the other hand, we're well aware of the issue of China in terms of balance of trade and other matters that you've heard previously during the campaign. I would observe at the beginning that for the Congress, it's much more raw political when it comes to trade. In the past, you could see Congress feeling that they had to support the administration, and that the issues that the administration that they had to take up had to be dealt with the administration in partnership. Now, much more than ever, what you hear in the Congress is a reflection on the district or state where the member of Congress comes from, and their state interests. If they're a border state, you're going to hear more concern about NAFTA, as I indicated earlier. Congress is working under a Trade Promotion Authority, and they're beginning a negotiation on NAFTA with Canada and Mexico under its terms. Let's call it TPA, which are the initials, involves a trade between Congress and the White House. On the one hand, it permits fast track, whereby the administration in making a deal with another country has some guarantee, or it's not a guarantee, some assurance that that Congress will go along with it, that they won't just suddenly switch the terms of an agreement. So the White House feels, and the administration's always felt, that they needed a little extra authority when they offered up a bill or a treaty to Congress, so that they had more negotiating room. But the flip side is that Congress has demanded a much more meaningful role in all these trade negotiations, especially as time has gone on. And insofar as the NAFTA is concerned, already we've seen a number of hearings that have taken place, both with Bob Lighthizer and then subsequently with the committees of the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm expecting something more coming out of the Finance Committee. But I tell you that the last bullet is an important one. It's the leverage that the Congress has. There's an off switch. If the administration fails to meet the TPA consultation requirements, Congress can then deny them the fast track, and that fast track then in turn chills the negotiation that exists with a foreign country. These are the dates for you to pay attention to in terms of NAFTA. And I would tell you that I think that NAFTA will have more consequence to us than we anticipated at the beginning. We always said, how will it affect customs brokers? Well, I think that the negotiators will find a way. I think these are the key elements that we're going to expect to hear from in terms of the negotiations. And but I would turn to the next slide, which tells you a little bit more about where NCBFAA has been insofar as its interests. Drawback, we've written in support of the proposal that a coalition of different associations led by essentially drawback brokers have been supportive of, and that is removing the restrictions from the NAFTA agreement, the drawback restrictions. I think another issue that's really made a dent in everyone's consciousness is the de minimis thresholds, which are so markedly different. We've got the U.S. at $800, Canada and Mexico down nearer to zero, and neither Canada nor Mexico expressing any willingness whatsoever to budge. The association's position has to be, in some fashion, reconcile these differences, harmonize these differences. So we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll tell you that the border adjustment tax has always been the top of the page of the newspaper when it comes to talking about Congress's attitude towards trade. It remains controversial. It has not, however, gained much traction, and you hear more and more of members who will say out loud, members of the House who initially had been wanting to stay quiet in support of their leadership, but also the Senate, that there is not support for the border adjustment tax. Remains to be seen. Congressman Brady has said, go bold, go permanent, go now. But then at the same time, inside conversations and more, you hear him talking about alternative approaches and phase in for different industries, but looking to find some way to split the difference here. So it's someone sort of looking, I think, for a deal. Also this year, towards the end of the Congress, we're going to have, or at least we have scheduled, and I think the support for is the famous MTB, the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill. The ITC has already made some findings on recommendations, but they will submit their final recommendations to Congress in August. And the point that they're shooting for legislation is November, December. And then some people have always been interested in GSP. They're always asking me, what are we going to do about GSP when it runs out? Well, we've had the luxury of a couple of years without that question. But I think as we get closer to the end of this year, we're going to hear it more and more. I think the question about the MTV and the GSP is another reality check for the administration. The administration wants the U.S. to develop sort of made in USA manufacturing capabilities. Do these programs undermine this? Or should we instead accept the current reality of a need for inputs? There are going to be parts, there are going to be products that we do not have the capability to manufacture. And is that a compromise with this concept of made in the USA and pushing us in that direction? Frankly, I think GSP and MTBs will move along without a lot of consternation, but we shall see there. International and associated developments have become an important part of our world, and that's, for example, our involvement now at NCBFAA within the WCO is a reflection of that. We just have to have greater interest internationally. But let me talk about something domestically. We're looking for the next page on the outlook for the ports and the unions. And I think we're hearing very hopeful signs that the unions and business are interested in working something out. I think they're skittish about what might exist with the administration and their attitudes, and what role the administration might take in some sort of a work stoppage or some sort of disruption at the ports. I think there's also a long-term memory of what took place before. So moving on to the next slide, headed up by West Coast and followed by East and Gulf Coast. This is where things stand right now. As I said, I think there's a good reason to be optimistic that something can be worked out. But NCBFAA has been interested in the results here, written as part of a coalition of business and transportation-related interests in support of moving ahead with these negotiations. Internationally, we've got Brexit. There's 2 years left, a little less than 2 years, and we don't know what the disruption might be within the EU. I think you'll notice that the EU just made an agreement with Japan on a free trade agreement, and that kind of solidifies the trade positions within the EU it's a sort of a reaffirmation of the EU as a trading entity. In part, some of these agreements are taking place because of our international posture, posture of being America first, take care of America, and some of these other countries have been sort of upset by that, can we say. I think the TPP withdrawal was sort of an element of that distress. I think it's led to the movement of countries away from making deals with the U.S. and trying to find new partnerships that they can be happy with. Finally, let me just conclude with the picture of the car going down the highway, down the road, and tell you that I frankly don't know where we're going. I see things being moderated, but I see some things where we're going to raise hackles, and I see other things where we're going to take a more deliberate approach, and I think it'll work out on a case-by-case basis. Megan?
Thank you so much, John. We've got a couple of questions, and while we wait to see if there's any more questions that come in, I want to remind everybody who's listening that the Government Affairs Conference this year is September 10th through the 12th. It'll be here in D.C. again at our same hotel, and it's really very vital that the folks that can come, make appointments with your elected representatives, really trying to make your voice heard and make the industry's position stronger. So the first question that we have is, what are the prospects of changing NAFTA RVC rules to give them the country-specific thresholds?
Boy, frankly, I don't know. That's the answer to the question. I haven't been following that. RVC. Charles?
Yes. Yes,
RVC
John.
stands for?
Wait a second, hold on. I got distracted by something in the office. What was that, John?
Never mind. I'm going to answer your question in the next MMB.
Okay, that sounds great. And for the folks that are listening, we're going to have a brief recap of the legislative webinar as well, and we're recording it, and it'll be posted online if folks want to view it, listen to it at a later date. The next question is, what are the major industries that you see impacted by the NAFTA renegotiation?
I think agriculture is for sure. I think that's where we're most concerned about maintaining a status quo, and where there's a reasonable amount of contention between all three countries. Other than that, frankly, I think we're going to work around the edges on a great number of issues. The data, the freedom of using data interchangeably, is a big issue, and that involves some of the high-tech industry, and I think the high-tech industry is likely to weigh in very affirmatively on that one.
And within agriculture, do you see any differentiation on the GMO, non-GMO issue?
It doesn't seem to be an issue that is really hit home within our three countries. I can be corrected on that, but I haven't heard much of it. It's an issue that seems to reside principally in Europe, and is sort of got Europe tangled up on how to negotiate on that issue. So no, I don't think so.
Okay, keep your NAFTA hats on. We've got a couple more NAFTA questions. Does the trade need to do anything else, perhaps additional meetings with staff in Washington, those sorts of activities for the priorities that we want to see passed through the NAFTA negotiation?
Yes, and I think part of it is that we've testified, of course, through a written testimony as to what we're interested in seeing taken up within the NAFTA. A lot will depend on the access that we're provided through the negotiators, and a lot will depend on what issues emerge as the negotiations get underway in August. Congress will have a role. They generally, unless it's a major issue for a domestic state or a district, would rather sit back and generally give sort of the way for negotiators to move and just send letters. But as the negotiations go forward, we have to see what heats up and where we have strong issues at stake. So that doesn't lend itself necessarily for something that we know will take place in early September, the GAC. On the other hand, it just might. We might have moved to a point when we do the GAC that there's a very important issue that requires our going to the Hill on. But in the meantime, I will be maintaining strong relationships and dialogue with the two trade committees on the Hill, the Ways and Means and the Finance Committee, and that's how NCBFAA will exert its influence overall.
Will the U.S. challenge the Mexico IVA and the Canadian and Canada GST during the NAFTA renegotiations?
Don't know. I haven't heard that, but I don't know.
Okay, and I think the last NAFTA question is, do you have any insight as to whether the Mexico sectoral program will be challenged in the NAFTA renegotiation?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think everyone is keeping their cards close to their vest. I mean, we've had 3 days worth of testimony at the ITC, one after another, with one issue after another, and I think the administration is sorting through it all and still taking stock about what it's interested in doing and where it will take things.
And then, okay, I lied. One more NAFTA question. Do you have any insight as to how much detail will be released regarding the NAFTA renegotiations on July 17th?
I'm sorry, I don't see what July 17th is. August 17th?
I think that, yeah, I think they meant August 17th.
Yeah, you know, typically the way the administrations, and this will be done by the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, these negotiations, they like to stay pretty mum during the course of negotiations. And that's always been something that Congress and that the some of the more liberal organizations, labor unions, have objected to was the fact that they could never really get sufficient information about where negotiations were headed and what was up and what was down. In some respects, it's USTR trying to keep their negotiations out of the newspaper and to reduce controversy. The discussions they have on Capitol Hill with members of Congress are by and large just between them and the members of Congress. They go up and do briefings, but those briefings are closed. So how do you find out? What you find out is by being associated with an industry organization, a group of organizations, let's just say the apparel trade, and those groups will go in and meet with the U.S. trade representative and candidly be spoon-fed information. And it's not until you get to the big public sessions in a free trade agreement or the closing sessions of this perhaps, where everybody crowds into a foreign city and spends time in the hallways learning about what's taking place and trying to jawbone it to be otherwise.
And then I think the final question, should we be concerned with the recent introduction of HR 3001, the National Multimodal and Sustainable Freight Infrastructure Act, which proposes taxing freight movement in the United States, even those associated with import or export?
Yeah, you know, that's legislation that's been around in a different form for several years now, and that's precisely the divisive issue that exists that keeps it from ever getting very far. I spent quite a lot of time on Capitol Hill a couple of months ago during Transportation Week and afterwards, where the question for members of Congress, the question for the public was, where do we get the money from? And this answer, the answer that you tax or you create some sort of a levy against imports and exports, even indirectly, is not a satisfactory one for many people, nor is the gas tax, for that matter. That raises hackles, even when it seems to be an obvious solution to, in some way, in part. So I don't think we need to be concerned about it immediately, but it's certainly something the association has to stay on top of.
Okay. Well, thank you, John and Charles, so much. For the folks on the phone, if you are at all interested in attending the GAC, please make your room reservations. We have increased the room block twice. We are not going to increase it again. You can always cancel your room reservations if you are not, do not end up being able to come, but we cannot guarantee that you are going to get them if you don't make them. The registration is now open. It's the first pop-up on our website, www.ncbfaa.org, and that is September 10th through 12th this year. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and thank you especially to John and Charles for putting together the content for today's presentation. Again, we will be sending out a PDF copy of the presentation as soon as the webinar concludes, as well as a short survey. We'd love if you could complete that survey and let us know how we're doing. Thank you again for your participation, and enjoy the rest of your day.